Ladies and gentlemen, we are a small section of the Grandfather Mountain Highlanders, your host pipe band for what would be the 46th year this year. We are up on MacRae Meadow in honor of the greatest Highland Games in the world, the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games, and we are just so proud and pleased to be here and play for you. And we're just going to play a couple of your favorites just to bring back some memories. We're going to play Scotland the Brave and Stop, and then we're going to play MacRae Meadow. So here we go. Before the rain hits, we played in the rain here before, and we can do it again because we are tough. Just Scotland the Brave. Yeah, just Scotland the Brave twice. If you start screwing, stop. Right. Quick. Huh.
Oh, when I die, bury me low, where I can hear the bonny Tweed flow. A sweeter place I never will know than the rolling hills o' the Border. Well, hello there. My name's Ed Miller, and for the last 28 years I've had the great pleasure of performing at the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games. So I'm just as disappointed as everybody else is that we're not doing it this year. So I hope a small presentation captured here on camera will fill in one of the gaps, at least. We'll feel like we're actually there. I want to talk about a part of Scotland that is very dear to me and where a lot of my father's family came from. Now, if you were going to divide Scotland into three areas, the north and the west we would describe as the Highlands and Islands. That's where the clan system existed until the 18th century, and really until the 19th century it was basically a foreign land to the rest of the country. It was different linguistically, religiously, socially. The whole system of life there was utterly foreign to people in the lowlands, which is the other half of Scotland. However, we can divide the lowlands into the central lowlands, which is the area where about 80% of Scots people live. All the cities of Scotland other than Inverness are in the central lowlands. But to the south of the lowlands is an area that is called the Borders. And there's a Scottish area called the Borders, and there's also the English Borders on the other side. And to me it is a distinct area with a fantastic history, particularly for songs and music. And I want to talk about that area today. I have one grandmother who was a Scot and one who was a Kerr. Those are two of the major names of the Scottish border country, and we'll talk more about those typical names of that area in a moment. But firstly, welcome to the Scottish Borders. And you'll see those gently rolling hills, moorland, and just a very different area. Not the rugged mountains and glens of the Highlands, but rolling hills of the Borders. Now, I know that Grandfather Mountain is called a Highland Games, but I do see lots of people there dressed in tartan with names like Elliot and Armstrong and Kerr and Maxwell and several other names that we'll mention later in this presentation. These are border names and therefore would have nothing to do with the clan system. The border people of southern Scotland had absolutely nothing in common with the Highland part of Scotland. Just want to get that off my chest. Basically the Borders comprises mainly the watershed of the River Tweed, with various other rivers running into it from the Cheviots from the south and from the Moorfoots and the Lammermuir Hills to the north, between Edinburgh and that watershed. And historically that area was divided into what we call marches. So there were three marches on the Scottish side, three on the English side, the east, middle and march. And each had a, I don't know what you'd call him, a leader or a man who was in control of the laws of that area, supposedly, but usually he was head of one of the main families of that area. One book I would recommend to read about the Borders is called Steel Bonnets, and it opens with a paragraph describing Richard Nixon, Billy Graham and Lyndon Johnston all waiting to meet Neil Armstrong after he'd been to the moon and been brought back into earthly circles. And the writer says that could be the back row of a border rugby team any day. Johnston, Graham, Nixon, Armstrong, these are all border names. So the people I'm talking about are not foreign to Americans. There are lots of border names. And also there is a connection with North Carolina from the Borders, just as there are a lot of Highlanders that came to North Carolina. There were also a lot of people who were either forced or decided to move from southern Scotland into Northern Ireland in the 1600s, And after several generations in Northern Ireland decided that it wasn't any better there, and they started to migrate across the Atlantic. And once they were there, they were referred to as the Scotch-Irish. These were not Highlanders. They didn't play the bagpipes. They didn't speak Gaelic. They were lowland borderers, and they settled the mountain areas. So you'll find a lot of the border names alive and well in the Smoky Mountains, in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. So there's some of the names that are most typical of the border country. As again I said, I'm partly a Scot and partly a Kerr, which is akin to being partly Hatfield and partly McCoy, because they were not the friendliest of people to each other. But never mind. But to this day, you will still find concentrations of those names in areas. So they've been there for 700-800 years. And if you look at their lineup for certain rugby teams in the south, if it's from Langham, you're going to find at least 3 or 4 Elliots in the team. And if it's from the Middle March, it would be a couple of Kerrs and probably a Scot or 2 as well in that team. Nowadays, the Borders is not highly populated, except for sheep, or as they call them in that part of the world, yows. Here's a typical view. That's the Yarrow Valley, and you see things that are very typical of the border country. Those low, rolling hills that we sang about, the yows with their lambs, and dry stone dikes, dry stone walls, which separate all the fields in the Borders, and they were mainly built in the early 1800s, and they're still standing now, not any mortar used, and you'll see them everywhere. So let's sing that chorus one more time. Join in if you can. Oh, when I die, bury me low, where I can hear the bonny Tweed flow. A sweeter place I never will know than the rolling hills o' the Border. So there's some typical pictures of the rolling hills, the yows, the hills, and the dry stone dikes. And if you go in May or June, then the colour on the hillsides other than green is yellow, and it can be either gorse, which is a very prickly, nasty shrub, or it can be broom. And we'll mention the broom again later when we get to a song, like many Scots songs that mentions broom. In the 12th century, David I, who was actually brought up in England under Norman control, came back to Scotland and started to introduce various aspects of greater European culture to the border country. One of those things was to introduce various ecclesiastical orders from France, from Belgium, from elsewhere on the European continent. And he inspired the building of some major abbeys in several of the towns right across the Scots borders. They're only in ruins now, as you can see there from Dryborough Abbey, because the Reformation of the mid-16th century, which was extremely strong in Scotland, Calvinism rose and swelled, and anything that smacked of Catholicism or idolatry was completely ruined and razed if possible. So all we have left are the ruins of some of the great abbeys of the southern part of Scotland. Dryborough, there's Melrose with the Eildon Hills in the background. There's Jedburgh. Melrose, probably one of the most gorgeous and biggest buildings in Scotland in its day, and now a ruin. And that is where Robert the Bruce's heart is buried, and it was brought back from the Holy Land and taken back to the homeland and put in Melrose Abbey. So those are the Eildon Hills, or two of the Eildon Hills. They were referred to by the Romans, who built a very large fort down by the River Tweed below the Eildons. They call them the Trimontium, the three hills, because that photograph, I'm standing on one of them and you're looking at the other two. And the story goes that the devil demanded to a local magician by name of Michael Scott that he should cleave that hill into three pieces. So he did so, and to this day there's the three hills of the Eildon Hills, and many border people feel that they're not really at home if they can't see the Eildons. It's a symbol of the whole border country. Nice hiking country. Another song we can do describes exactly what's in that view that you're looking at right now. It's a song called Caw the Yows, or Drive the Sheep in English. Caw the yows tae the now, caw them while the heather grows, caw them while the bonny rows, my bonny dearie. So a pastoral song, but it mentions driving the sheep up to where the heather is growing, and this photograph is taken in the early summer, so the heather is still brown, it hasn't turned purple yet. And you can see the yows on the hill, and you can see a couple of burnies, small streams coming down the hill. So that's what that song is about. For me, it completely captures the scenery, the landscape of the border country, and I have a bee in my bonnet about the fact that music songs go together with place and landscape. When I take people over there in the summer on tours, that's what we're basically aiming to do. So we sing a song like that in the Scots border country. There you can see another example of the rolling hills. No trees left from the old days, although there's still parts of the borders referred to as forests, Ettrick Forest, Jed Forest, but there are no old forest remnants left. And there's the yows, mainly black-headed sheep, hardy creatures because they have to survive the winter in one of the harshest winter areas of Scotland outside the Highlands. So I'll just show you a few typical pictures. Again, you see the sheep, the yows, you see the burn, the stream, and you see the dry stone dikes, the dry stone walls. Now this one includes, well, the four words that I've used here: dry stone, dike, yows, and one more word that's absolutely a border word and not used anywhere else, and that's the word clwch. And a clwch is a cut in the side of the hill. So you can see in the background there that small ravine coming down through the hills, and the yows with their lambs in front of the dry stone dike. And if you're driving around the borders, of course, you have to make way for the main population when they come by. Shepherds used to walk the hills of the borders, and their dogs would run with them. Life is a lot easier nowadays with four-wheel, all-terrain vehicles. So there's another view. This is a churchyard, a kirkyard, called St Mary's Kirkyard above the St Mary's Loch, and I always love to go up there because there's an old ballad that goes with that place. In fact, I'll read you part of it. It would take about 15 minutes to sing because ballads in the old days, people had a much longer attention span. But it's called the Douglas Tragedy, where a knight runs off with the daughter of the Douglas family, and the wife of the Douglas family says, "Get up and chase him, my 7 sons and my husband." So they do. They chase after him. They have a battle between the knight. He slays all 7 sons and the father, and they journey on, he and his true love that he has stolen away. Stops by a burn to wash himself, and his lady friend sees it turning red. And he says, oh no, it's just the moon as it goes down over the hills shining in the water, but it was blood. So they get to his mother's house, where he lays asleep, and he is dead by the morning. And in true ballad style, she's also dead of a broken heart. So they're taken and they're buried in this churchyard that is in that picture. And again, a very common motif. Lord William was buried in St Mary's Kirkyard, Lady Margaret in Mary's choir. And out of the lady's grave grew a bonny red rose, and out of the knight's a briar. And they twa met, and they twa plat, and fain they would be near, so all the world might ken recht weel that they were lovers dear. Now that's a common motif in ballads on both sides of the Atlantic, where true lovers are buried and what grows out of their graves twines in a sign of true love. This, however, is a border ballad, and there's no way you're going to have a happy ending. The last verse. By and rode the Black Douglas, and wow, but he was rough, and he pulled up the bonny briar and flung it in St Mary's Loch. Tragic ending to a tragic ballad. But you can sing that song on location when you go there. So again, a typical view, and that circular wall is what's called a sheepfold or a fank. And it's what they used in the old days when they brought the sheep down off the hills to dip them or clip them or whatever they were doing with the sheep. Gather them together. Again, I'm just giving you a general overview of what the scenery is in that part of the world. Or to Ettrickdale or Yarrowside, where the ghosts of the Reavers they still ride. With a ballad heroes I will bide, deep in the hills of the borders. You'll see in the background on the hillside there a tower, or as it's called in that part of the world, a peel tower or a keep. And these were common right across the border country. These were completely defensive buildings. There's a few left. Most of them are in ruins, a few have been renovated, and they were to provide a defensive site for when raiders, or what are called in that part of the world reavers, would attack. You might lose your cattle or your sheep, and your outhouses may be burnt, but to get into one of these keeps was near impossible. The walls were 10 feet thick, and there, as you can see, there were very few windows and only one door that was extremely thick. That map shows the distribution of peel towers on both sides of the border. There's many in Northumberland and Cumberland as well on the English side, and you could do a magic tour to go around and visit them all. There is Newark Tower in the Yarrow Valley, and if you're a Walter Scott fan, then that was the setting for the Lay of the Last Minstrel. And Scott used all his knowledge of the borders in putting his songs together. Ferniehurst Castle was the castle of the Kerr family, K-E-R-R, which is how it's pronounced, not Kerr. Sorry, it's a bee in my bonnet. Happens to be my middle name. Needpath Castle, which has been renovated just very recently on a perch above the Tweed River in Peebles. And there we're back at Kirkhope Tower in the Yarrow Valley. The ruins of Greenknow Tower. And Borthwick Castle, to which Mary Queen of Scots and her lover ran when she was chased out of Edinburgh. I think Maria Callas rented it during the Edinburgh Festival once for all her entourage, and it's now a very expensive hotel. Hermitage Castle, a very bleak, stolid kind of building near Langham. And Dryhope Tower, which is where the ballad I just talked about, the Douglas tragedy, took place. The Douglas family lived in that tower, and rode off to chase this interloper who'd stole the daughter away. However, I want to dwell for a while on one of the most important towers as far as Ballad collection and Sir Walter Scott are concerned. This is Smailham Tower, which was reconstructed in I think the 1980s, so it's quite recent, although it was reconstructed really, really well in the old style. Used to belong to the Pringle family. It then moved into a family called Scott, strangely enough, and it was owned by the grandfather and grandmother of Sir Walter Scott. And I should talk about Scott for a while here, because he is absolute key man in having created the whole myth, the whole image of the border country. Scott was born in Edinburgh, so a well-to-do family. His father was a lawyer. He went to the Royal High School there, but he couldn't play and run around like most of the kids because he had one very skinny leg, a weak leg, which we almost certainly would think now was polio. However, he had a tremendous imagination, and he was very popular among his fellow kids because he could tell stories. He could make up stories about anything he saw or any old characters he saw around Edinburgh. And he went to school at the Royal High School in actually the same building where I did a degree in geography much later, in the 1960s. But as a young boy, his parents thought, well, he's just a weakling. We need to send him out to the country and strengthen him up. So they sent him down to Sandy Now's farm, which is just behind where this picture was taken of Smailham Tower. And he spent his days out on the hillsides with some of the old shepherds, the old ploughmen, the cattlemen, from whom he picked up not just the dialect of the area, but all kinds of bits of ballads and magical stories. Scott had a photographic memory, and these all stuck and were all used in his later creations. So I recommend anyone who's going to the border country that Smailham Tower should be one place you should definitely visit. If you've ever read Marmion, then a large part of that comes from inspiration that Scott had looking at this tower, letting his imagination run wild and picture a knight coming down from the tower and marching off to fight in the ill-fated Battle of Flodden in 1513. I'm sure you can read for yourself, but and still I thought that shattered tower the mightiest work of human power, and marvelled as the ancient hind with some strange tale bewitched my mind, of warriors who from headlong force down from that strength had spurred their horse, their southern rapine to renew, far in the distant Cheviot blue. So if anyone wishes to struggle through Walter Scott, he's not an easy read, then that is part of Marmion. And you can see the view that was available from Smailham Tower. That view is looking east. It looks all the way down the Tweed Valley. On a very clear day, you can just about see the North Sea, so you could see anybody approaching up that valley. To the south, you would see all the way to the Cheviot Hills, marking the border with England. To the north, to the Lammermuir Hills, and maybe, if you're very lucky, you might even see over the Lammermuir Hills and see some of the landscape of Edinburgh. And to the west, of course, looking up the Tweed Valley and over to the Eildon Hills. There's another view looking east. So you can see it commands a fantastic view. And these towers were spaced in such a way that one could be seen from another. So if some invaders were coming, a signal would be set off like a fire, and the message would be passed through the chain of towers right through the borders that danger was approaching. Why I love to go to Smilham Tower especially is because it's been dedicated in recent times to the ballads, the songs collected by Sir Walter Scott. And in there are small, wonderful creations, each of which represents one of the ballads that Scott collected. Scott would make what he called raids into the valleys of the borders, particularly up the Yarrow Valley and the Ettrick Valley, where he would collect ballads from some of the older population. And one of his basic beliefs was that those songs and ballads were disappearing, and he needed to collect them before they went so they could be held forever. So this one is of the famous ballad Thomas the Rhymer. So Thomas the Rhymer, one of the best and biggest and earliest ballads collected in the borders. Kind of the American version of Rip Van Winkle in some ways, where Thomas from Earlston, or Erceldoune in those days, was sleeping under a tree when he saw a beautiful woman with a horse decorated with bells and silver and beautiful silk upholstery. He thought it was the Virgin Mary, and he wanted to embrace her, but the woman looked down and said, "No, I am not the Virgin Mary. I am the Queen of the Fairies, and you cannot kiss me, because if you do, then you will be my procession for the next 7 years." Thomas of Erceldoune says, to hell with that, gives her a big wet one, at which point he is taken off by the Queen to fairyland, and they have an interesting journey. They cross a river which is full of the tears spilt in the world that day. They cross another river filled with blood, and that's the bloodshed in the world today. And finally they go down one small, partly hidden track, rather than the wide open ones that are so tempting. They go down the small one of righteousness and truth and honour, and finish up in fairyland. Now, one of the unbelievable things about this story is that the Queen says, you can be here for 7 years, and if you're still here after 7 years, you can go back to your own people. But one condition, and that is that you never utter a word. Now, I cannot imagine a Scotsman never uttering a word for 7 years, but things like that happen in ballads, so he does. And just before he leaves to go back to his own people, the Queen of the Fairies gives him a gift, and it's an apple. She says, "This is a gift which will give you the power of seeing the future, and also the gift of never telling a lie." Now, is that a gift or a curse? But when he did go back to his own people, believing that he'd just fallen asleep and was coming home the same day that he'd fallen asleep, he found things were changed. People stared at him, chased him up the street, wondered who he was, and it took a while for him to be reinitiated into his own family. His children had grown up, 7 years older, but gradually he was welcomed back in, and he became a highly respected man all around the border area for someone who could solve disputes. He was also one of the first known Scottish poets, or makers as they're called in Scots, and some of the prophecies he made did come true. For example, one in the 1300s, a period when, strangely enough, Scotland was in a peaceful situation for once. The King Alexander III, on his way home to Fife, was blown off a cliff and killed. He had no adult successor, and that began about a 300-year period of warfare and squabbling over who would be the ruler of Scotland. Anyway, that's one of the ballads. Another is the gory, gruesome story of a young woman who has found the dead body of her lover, a knight. And As I was walking all alane, I met twa corbies making a main, and ta'en and ta'e the t'other did say, oh, where shall we gang and dine the day, oh, where shall we gang and dine the day? It's in a hent yon old fell dyke, I want there lies a new slain knight, and naebody kens that he is there, oh, but he's Hogg and he's hound and his lady fair, oh, his Hogg and his hound and his lady fair. Well, he's Hogg tae the hunting gain, and he's hound to bring the wild fowl hame. His lady's ta'en another mate, oh, so we mun mak our dinner sweet, oh, we mun mak our dinner sweet. So you'll sit on his white horse bane, and I'll pike at his bonny blue wing, and we I'll lock always golden hair, oh, we'll think our nest when it grows bare, oh, we'll think our nest when it grows bare. For there's many a name for him Max Main, but none shall ken where he is gane, or has white banes when they are bare, oh, the wind shall blaw for evermore, oh, the wind shall blaw for evermore. It's a gruesome story of twa corbies, two crows, finding the dead body of a knight and eating it for lunch. Lovely things. Another of the great border ballads is the story of Tam Lin, which again is about 52 verses long, about again someone who has been taken away by the fairies. In this case, a young man who hides in the bushes and actually sees a young woman from the local village come in, because she thinks it's her forest on her father's land. But he says, no, this is not your forest, it belongs to the fairies. But they fall in love, as people do in ballads, very quickly. And also very quickly, as people do in ballads, she becomes pregnant. And she goes back to her people, and they wonder, well, who's the father? Is it one of the ploughmen? Is it a lord from down the road? She says, no, it's someone far better and different than that. And she tells him, I will come back to see you. And when she does, he says, well, my problem is that on Halloween Eve, I am going to be sacrificed. Every year the fairies sacrifice a human, and this year it's my turn. However, the only thing that can save me is true love, and if you can follow the following instructions. Hide just before midnight on Halloween in the bushes by the river. You'll see a parade of horses come by. The first one on the white horse will be the Queen. The second one will be her manservant. And the third one, a brown horse, I will be on it, although you may not recognize me for what I'm wearing. What you have to do is leap up and grab me and hold me tight, as tight you can, and do not let go. Which she does. And all kinds of magic things happen. The Queen turns Tam Lin into, first of all, a snake. Secondly, a red-hot iron poker. Thirdly, a lion. But still she holds on. And finally, she wraps him with a green cloth, and they jump into the river, which means he is now saved. The Fairy Queen is not happy and says, if I had known this was going to happen, I would have taken out those beautiful grey eyes of yours and replaced them with ones made of wood. Fantastic stories, even if you speak them rather than sing them. That's from a ballad called, if it's from the English side, it's called Chevy Chase. If it's from the Scottish side, it's called The Battle of Otterburn. And if it's the English version, the English win the battle. And of course, if it's the Scottish version, the Scots do. So you cannot trust ballads for historical accuracy. One of my favourite songs, even if I learnt it first from Joan Baez, but it got me thinking about balladry because there were aspects of her version that didn't fit with Scotland. So it made me go, when I was about 17 or 18, and start looking up old ballads. And I found, sure enough, it was a ballad originally from Scotland. Although probably now there are more versions alive and well and being sung by singers in the Appalachians rather than in Scotland. Yestreen the Queen had 4 Marys, the next shall hae but 3. There was Mary Beaton and Mary Seaton and Mary Carmichael and me. Mary Hamilton has been involved with the king in some versions, a lord in others, and has become pregnant. But to save the shame of the king or the lord, she murders her child in various different ways in different versions. But the queen, the real queen, has heard about this and asks, where is the baby? And she says, there never was a baby, but she has actually murdered. The queen then says, we must go to Edinburgh, which is the difference between the versions I heard from Appalachia, which say they must go to Glasgow. Glasgow at the time of this ballad being written was a village of about 15 people, and everything important in Scotland happened in Edinburgh. So she is taken to Edinburgh, where she insists not in wearing robes of black or brown, but robes of white. As she get to the Cannon Gate, she laughed loud laughters 3. But when she come back up the Cannon Gate, she was condemned to die. So she is beheaded, which is a warning to any mother that kills their own child. So that is the top level of Smailham Tower, is dedicated to the ballads that have supernatural elements. The next lower down level is dedicated to ballads that do have some connection to historical events, and most of those concerned with the exploits of the border reavers. We'll talk about more in a moment. And one of my favourites is the ballad of Kinmont Willie Armstrong, one of the most infamous and wild of the border reavers, who was captured by Lord Scrope from Northern England, from Carlisle, taken there and jailed. And as he goes into the castle, in typical cavalier form, Willie says, "I'll thank you when I leave for your hospitality." The word gets back to the border country that he's been kidnapped, and the head of the Scott clan, the Duke of Buccleuch, gets together with Armstrongs, Elliots, and a few other compadres, and they go down to Carlisle with all kinds of things with them. And they swim over the river to get to the castle, even though the river's in spate. They release Kinmont Willie, and of course, as he goes by the captain's place of abode, he shouts, "Thank you very much for your hospitality, and if you're ever in Scotland, I will return it to you." They take him back down. He's still got his chains on, hence that second verse there where the man that's bringing him down, Red Rowan, complains about how he kicked and squirmed as he brought him down the ladder. Anyway, they take him back to the border country. They cross the river again, which is in spate. So English people can't cross the border, only Scottish people can. Again, the license of balladry. So there's a small summary again of the Ballad of Kinmont Willie. I think it's 42 verses. Another one with a less happy outcome was one about Johnny Armstrong. Again, one of the most wicked, wild and infamous of the Border Reavers. And James V, who was very embarrassed by the fact that the whole area between him and England had turned into an area of anarchy, simply captured the Armstrongs by inviting them to come and have a parley with him, at which point he summarily hung the whole lot of them. So not a very happy ballad, that one, but quite realistic. Again, we go back to Walter Scott, who collected these ballads from people in the valleys of the borders on his raids. One of them, or one of his major informants, was the mother of another border poet and writer by name of James Hogg. Her name was Margaret Laidlaw. She always went by her maiden name. She didn't really sing, she more chanted the ballads, and she had an incredible repertoire, all of which she had learnt orally, and she was illiterate. So when Scott collected them and printed them in his Minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders, she was not happy about it. So there's that wonderful quote when she says, "There was never one of my songs printed until you did, and you've spoilt them all. Now they'll never be sung again because they were made for singing. The charm has been broken and they'll never be sung anymore." So that was a real put down for this well-to-do, almost upper class Sir Walter Scott. However, as one of my professors used to say, no ballad died of printer's ink. It just froze it like you freeze a photograph, although people might look different in different photographs. Also, there are different versions of each of the ballads. So there he is, again, some of the dolls at Smailham Tower. Hogg's mother, Sir Walter Scott in the middle with his henchman Willie Laidlaw, and James Hogg on the left. We'll talk more about him in a minute. But do remember the pattern of cloth that Hogg is wearing there. So Walter Scott gained so much income from his early novels, the first romantic novels, romantic historical novels ever written, things like The Lady of the Lake, Rob Roy MacGregor, Marmion, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. He was incredibly popular, the most popular writer in the world at that time. Sold books all over Western Europe and all over America too, particularly in the South, where his stories of chivalry and knighthood and loyalty to family struck a chord. In fact, Mark Twain went as far as saying perhaps he was partly responsible for the Civil War here in America, because the southern plantation owners believed so much in this gallantry and pageantry. I think that's taken it a bit much. But in the background there in that slide is the house he built called Abbotsford, near where abbots from the nearby Melrose Abbey would ford the river. You can see it's kind of a mixture of styles. Some people called it Conundrum Castle because it has a bit of everything. There's a Moorish tower, there's Gothic, there's classical Greek, there's all kinds of things stuck together. And it's typical of Scott himself. He was really what you might call a magpie. He liked to collect things, historical things. And if you ever go to Abbotsford, you'll see, for example, a lock of Bonnie Prince Charlie's hair. You'll find pistols that belonged to the Covenanters in the 1600s. You'll find Napoleon's pocketbook. And Scott wrote a whole life of Napoleon. There's a hunting bottle from James V. And there's battlefield relics from the Battle of Flodden. So Abbotsford contains things that the Waverley novels also contained. And the Waverley novels contain things from Abbotsford that reflect Scott's fascination with history. So he basically ransacked Scotland's architecture. to make this amazing building. The ceiling, for example, in the library is a copy of the ceiling at Roslin Chapel, built in the 1100s. John Knox's pulpit from the 1560s is used in there. Oak panelling, modelled on the old kirk in Dunfermline, which used to be Scottish capital. The bedsteads of Mary Queen of Scots are there, although they're now just decorative devices. So again, it shows how this man was fascinated with the history of Scotland and of using all those historical elements in the ballads that he collected and refurbished, and particularly in the books that he wrote. So it's not unusual that it's absolutely appropriate that there should be a book called Scotland, because Scott really is the inventor of Scotland, or the reinventor of Scotland. Before his time, the Highlands, for example, were regarded as some foreign country where barbarians lived. They were mountainous, dangerous, there were hardly any roads up there. But when Scott wrote The Lady of the Lake, based in Loch Katrine, it appealed to all the romantics in the Celtic twilight, as you might want to call it, just like the Ossian ballads had done just a few years earlier. And the Highlands changed from a wild, mountainous area full of barbarians who can't speak English into scenery. Scenery to be enjoyed by the better classes from the lowlands and from England. And one of the main people that followed that influx, that interest, was Queen Victoria, who just fell in love with the Highlands and went so far as to build a huge house, which I'm sure you all have heard of, called Balmoral, and was followed in suit by all kinds of members of the aristocracy from England who would build their own country houses and shooting lodges in the Highlands. And the whole Highland area changed from a working way of life with a clan system to being colonised by outsiders who saw the land as something for their playground or for their commercial use. He also did the same for the border country by writing about the Reavers, romanticising who they were. His library, by the way, is by far the greatest library in Scotland. Absolutely amazing collection of books. And I wouldn't be surprised if he read them all, because the man had a photographic memory and he read very, very quickly. So there's all kinds of places in the borders associated with him. One is one of the most beautiful viewpoints I know anywhere in the world. It's called Scott's View. And it's a view from a hillside looking over a meander of the Tweed River over to the Eildon Hills in the background. So you can see all three there in that picture. And again, lovely, lovely hiking country. And look who we've found here, standing at Scott's View. But one of Scotland's greatest fiddle players, Ian Fraser, and some guy from North Carolina called E.J. Jones with his small pipes. And I have had the huge pleasure of singing again on location at Scott's View. Cut this bit out. Right. And the song we are singing in that picture is one called The Broom of the Cowden Knowes. About 200 yards left of where I'm standing is a farm called the Cowden Knowes, and there's a wonderful old ballad about a shepherd who has unfortunately fallen in love with the daughter of the owner of all the land and all the sheep, and so he's forced to go into exile and sing sad songs about the borders that he can no longer go to. So this song has everything you could need from a Scots ballad. It has love, separation, class conflict, emigration and sheep. All the basic ingredients. Oh, blithe was I each morn to see my lass come o'er the hill. She skipped the barn and she ran to me. I welcomed her with goodwill. Oh, the broom, the bonny, bonny broom, the broom of the Cowden House. Fain would I be in my ain country, head in her father's years. And the last verse, farewell our border hills, farewell, farewell our pleasures there, to wander by your side once again is all I crave or care. Oh, the broom, the bonny, bonny broom, the broom of the Cowden House. Fain would I be in my ain country, heard in her father's yell. The broom of the Cowden House. And that, of course, is the song we're singing in that picture. Again, my fascination with singing songs, quote, on location, unquote. So we'll go back to the other border writer, songwriter, poet, James Hogg. Hogg was born 1770, lived till 1835. He was a shepherd by trade, what school he had was finished by the time he was 7, and he took to the hills looking after ewes, looking after the sheep. He was, however, an amazing character. He was really part of the oral tradition, i.e. part of what we call the folk, but he was also part of the whole blossoming of Scottish writers, poets, song collectors of that period. He, like Scott, was influenced by what was going on as a kind of international movement in Western Europe at that time called nationalism. So you can look at what Hans Christian Andersen was doing in Denmark, or the Brothers Grimm in Germany. They were collecting what they thought was the folk music, the folk creations, the stories of the real people of each of their countries to show what was distinct about their countries. Ironically, when folklorists and writers compared the different versions of ballads and stories from one country to another, they realized that they had similar versions of the same story in each place. They were just localized to one area. They were basically based on international floating motifs that have been around for thousands of years. Anyway, Hogg was self-taught, an autodidact, I think is what he's called, and he taught himself how to play the fiddle, how to read, and he read voraciously, started writing poetry, and really had the idea that he would be the next in line of great Scottish writers and poets after Robert Burns. i.e. he had as what we call, quite a fair conceit of himself. He didn't succeed at first, but in 1810 he went up to Edinburgh, where he caused quite a stir with his accent and his behaviour, country boy. And finally, he published a collection called The Poetic Mirror and The Queen's Wake, which were picked up and read by the likes of Wordsworth, Byron, and Scott and other contemporaries. And he did become very successful. In fact, so successful he was invited to the coronation of George IV in London, but he said no, he couldn't go that day because that was the market in Moffat, and he had to be at the market. Typical of the border shepherd. I'd love to have met this man. He sounds incredible and very different from Sir Walter. He wore that check style when he did go to Edinburgh and when he went to London, and people started taking note of that check. They thought, that's rather nice. They started asking for it in the best tailors of the West End of London, and they in turn had to send up to the borders to get it. And thereon started the industrialization of what had previously been just a small cottage industry, ever since the monks of the abbeys brought sheep and weaving to the borders. There was huge demand for these designs, and I'd say from the, well, almost the mid-19th century up till just 20 years or so ago, woolen mills were the life and now death of the border towns, and supplied wool all over the world. Hogg and Scott used to meet in a hotel, or an inn, a coaching inn in those days, in the Yarrow Valley, called the Gordon Arms, and there is still on the wall a plaque where James Hogg writes a letter of commendation for the bar owner. And there is a nice example of broom as well, if you're wondering what broom looks like. It's all over the country in May and June, symbol of what's euphemistically called the approach of summer. Hogg is memorialised by a statue in the Yarrow Valley at the end of St Mary's Loch, looking over to an ancient inn called Tibby Shields Inn, where he was one of the main customers over the years. And Tibby Shields, the old woman who ran that establishment, described this new statue as a clay-called likeness. So again, always wearing that mixed black and white with just a little bit of brown in it sometimes. But he again, in his poems, not so much as Scott, but in his poems, wrote of the border reavers, the raiders. Now, how did they come about that these people lived there? The border country of Scotland and England was for centuries an area of warfare. Armies went back and forward, scourging the countryside, murdering people one way or the other. So a certain way of life grew up where people fended for themselves as bandits, I think you would call it. And after the Battle of Flodden in 1513, which left the king dead and nearly all the nobles of Scotland dead and a huge number of Scots fighters dead, the borders turned into an area basically of anarchy. And gradually these gangs began, and that's gang is where this is a word of many that came from the borders originally, formed to protect themselves, and that developed into them being raiders and people who stole cattle, sheep. Basically they're bandits and they're warlords. And I know they've been romanticised hugely, but if we look at what they realistically were, they were looters, rapers and pillagers. And it's kind of, in a way, unfortunately, that they have become the representative symbol of the border country to this day. There's a main statue of a border reaver in the town of Galashiels. They do what do you call them, recreations of border battles. The best book about the border reavers is one by Alistair Moffat, who's a borderer himself, and of course there is Smailham Tower on the cover. Now, I mentioned that there was basically a collection of warlords and their followers. The warlords were the head of distinct families like Scots, Elliot, Armstrong, Kerr, Maxwell, Rutherford, all those border names. And that was what was most important to a border reaver. He didn't think of himself as Scottish or English. He thought from the Scots side he was a Kerr or a Scot or an Elliot or so on. On the border side he was a Charlton, a Fenwick, or whatever the names were in the border country of England. And that's who they held loyalty to. They might at times make alliances with another family for a major raid or a major revenge attack, but it was families that were most important. But even today, that feuding between families is there's still a huge rivalry between the different towns of the border country. They all have distinct cultures. My father, who was from the borders, said he could tell which town people were from by the way they spoke. Now, some of these towns are only 8, 12 miles apart, but different dialect, or noticeably in certain words that you can tell. And I think it's interesting that the all-star team from the border country in rugby is called the Border Reavers. And this is the only part of Scotland where rugby is the most important sport. Everywhere else, football, as soccer for Americans, was the most important. And there are huge rivalries. There's one between the Jedburgh team and the Hogg team. And Granny was from Hogg, so I guess I'd have to support them. Biggest rivalry in the borders is Melrose against Galashiels. These towns are all of 3 miles apart. Huge rivalry. And it's the only area of Scotland where you'll find all the classes playing rugby and watching it. So a lot of the mill workers, the woolen mill workers, were rugby players. But so were some of the middle class white collar workers and some of the aristocracy in the border country too. Whereas in the rest of Scotland, rugby was very much one of the better classes, and the working classes, they played football. So I was a misfit. I went to a rugby playing school, but much preferred to play football outside of school. The other aspect of the rivalry between the towns in the border country is the fact that they each have 1 week every summer that's called their Gala Week or their Reavers Week or their Common Riding, in which the whole town turns out, and often many people who came from that town or relatives of people who came from that town come back to the town for that week. It goes back to a very old ritual going back to the 1500s, where people from the town would ride round the borders of the town to make sure that it hadn't been encroached upon by large landowners or by bandits or farmers or whatever, and they would ride round the edge of the property and then come back to the town and celebrate their uniqueness of being from Galashiels, from Langham, from Selkirk, from Hogg, from Duns. So these next few pictures are all of aspects of the common ridings. And I've yet to find out the significance of the spade in the Langham week. But each one has its own traditions, its own rituals, and the whole population turns out. It's a very special week of kind of kind of reveling in your own town identity as distinct from the other towns. And you'll see just how many people make the ride, because in the background of that picture you can see there's still a whole line of horses almost a mile behind going round this ritual tour of the borders of the country, of the city rather. And they have to ford rivers. Each town has a young man who is chosen to represent the town for that week, and it's like being created king for a week, and it's a wonderful honour to be picked as, in Hogg's situation, the cornet. In Galashiels it would be the braw lad. In Duns it would be the Reaver lad. He has to be a young man of good standing. He has to be born and bred in that town, and he has to be quite fit and a good horseman and be able to hold his drink. Just a few other pictures to show you. And all kinds of rituals are carried out. One is where the riders all get together in a place called the hut. They swing back and forward and they sing a song called Terabis. I don't know the words of it, and even if I did, you probably wouldn't understand them at all, because Hogg has one of the strongest dialects in the whole area. You'll notice how many women are in that picture. Until recently, the border ridings were very much a male-dominated situation. But in the town of Hogg a few years ago, some very brave women said, we want to be part of it too. And they joined the riders going round. People threw stones at them. Even women cursed them as they went by. But they held firm. And nowadays, many women go on the ride as well. There's also other rituals, like in Hogg, there's a snuff box that's thrown into the crowd, and someone tries to capture it and carry it to a certain spot in the town. What it basically works out is a rammy, as we would call it, a big battle to try and find it, and most of the younger men are the ones who are involved. But you see, they go out into the country round the border of the town land. Now we're in Selkirk, and that banner supposedly was brought back by one of the few survivors from the Battle of Flodden in 1513. It's carried round in the ride. Then the ride comes back to the town of Selkirk, where the whole population has gathered, watched by the statue of Sir Walter Scott. And at which point the cornet, or the brolad, or whatever he's called, the royal standard bearer in Selkirk, has to then show his strength by performing all kinds of swinging and waving things with this huge flag. So he'd better be in good shape. So there he is in the middle of the square in Selkirk. Walter Scott standing above them all, and the whole population out to celebrate their being from Selkirk. Just a few more. These folk are from the town of Duns, my father's hometown. And I remember going to Reavers Week when I went there to stay with my aunt as a boy. So that guy in the middle is the Reaver for the week, and the Reaver's lass on his right. So again, he is hugely honoured to be the Reaver for that year. There's another one carrying the flag. So I'll leave you with just a few more photographs of the border country. I love this one. It captures the Yarrow River, the Broom in the foreground, the hills in the background. Those forests that you can see are not natural habitat for the borders. Those are 20th century plantations of conifers for the Forestry Commission. The Yarrow Valley features in many of the old ballads. It was one of the areas that Walter Scott collected from most. However, nearly all the ballads I've heard from that area are tragic. There's no survivors in some of them, and only a few in others. I think the favourite ballad I have is one called The Dowie Dens of Yarrow, the eerie, mysterious valley of the Yarrow River. It's about a young woman who has been courted by people of her higher class, of her class, but who is really in love with the ploughman from down the road. There was a lady in the north, you scarce could find her marrow. She was courted by 9 noblemen and a plough-boy lad frae Yarrow. And as he gaed up yon high, high hills, and down by the Humes of Yarrow, it's there he saw 9 noblemen come to fecht wi' him on Yarrow. He says there's one of me, but there's 9 of ye, and that's no equal marrow. But I'll fecht yous all, one by one, on the dowie dens o' Yarrow. So it's 3 he slew, and 3 he threw, and 3 he's wounded sadly, till our brother John crept in behind and wounded him most foully. So this young woman's true love has taken on the 9 noblemen and beaten them. However, the treacherous brother creeps up and stabs him from behind. So that's him dead. The young woman has a dream which leads her to believe that her lover is lying on the banks of the river Yarrow, and dreams always come true in ballads, so she goes and finds his body. And in a scene which goes back to Scandinavian balladry, her hair is so long she ties it round the middle of his body and takes him back to her home, where she accuses the father of causing the death, really, of her true love, and at which point she dies of a broken heart. She is at the time pregnant, so all 3 lovers finish up in the grave together, dead. Always an eerie feeling to go to the valley of the Yarrow River, and if I sing that song on location there, I feel like it should be misty and mysterious. And damned it, every time I go to the Yarrow, it's a beautiful sunny day, everything's crisp and clear, and you couldn't ask for nicer weather. So that's the Yarrow Valley, and one of the many, many ballads, murder ballads from there. There's St Mary's Loch, again another sheepfold, and you can see the typical treeless rolling hills of the border country. And some of the steep valleys of the borders have been dammed. This is a reservoir that provides water mainly for the city of Edinburgh. Some very steep and twisty roads in this area. And people live in this area still, some mainly sheep farmers. We are in this photograph only 18 miles from the centre of Edinburgh, but this place can be cut off for 2 or 3 weeks in the winter and just non-accessible because of heavy snow, and it might be a perfectly fine day in Edinburgh. The change region to region in Scotland is on such a tinier scale than in this country. So there's again another sign of St Mary's Kirkyard, where that tragic ballad took place. And there's a cloch in the background, and yows. And another picture from the Yarrow Valley showing how pervasive the Drystane dikes are. This one with 2 in a row, which I think shows that that was one of the old drove roads when cattle drivers would drive their cattle down into northern England to sell to the British Army, or they would be driving sheep up to the markets of central Scotland to be sold. But plenty stones in the fields to build these dikes. A place I always kind of make a pilgrimage when I go back to Scotland is the Leithen Valley, where the Leithen water runs down and joins the Tweed at Inner Leithen. So we'll say farewell to the main inhabitants of the border country, and we'll sing you the last verse of the Rolling Hills of the Borders. Thank you for joining me, and I hope in this rather vague ad-lib situation you have learnt something more about a distinct part of Scotland, and when you see the clan tents of quote clan unquote Armstrong or Elliot or any of the border names, then look at them a bit sideways, because they're trying to be Highlanders They're borderers and should be proud of the fact. So promise me that when I die, you'll spread my dust where the conlows cry, on Lammermuir or Moorfoot High, deep in the hills or the borders, all together. Oh, when I die, bury me low, where I can hear the bonny Tweed flow, a sweeter sound I'll never know than the rolling hills o' the border.